This is Matthew Cratter from Trade University, and today I want to talk about how Putin can destroy the U.S. economy. What I'm going to show you in this video, especially if you watch it all the way to the end, is I'm going to show you the very interesting connections between geopolitics, the commodity markets, and global macro. So on Friday, there was this announcement coming out of Russia that they would cut their oil output by 500,000 barrels per day in March of this year, in March of 2023. And this had the expected effect on the crude oil market. Crude oil was up sharply on the day, as were treasury rates, as were interest rates for the 10-year treasury, and really across most of the U.S. yield curve. So I want to talk about the connection between these two things because they're extremely important, especially when it comes to U.S. and Russian energy policy. So what happens when global crude oil prices rise? One of the things that happens that we really saw in 2022, for example, is that countries without oil reserves, or at least without large oil reserves, sell more U.S. treasuries that they're holding on the margin. They sell more on the margin in order to raise U.S. dollars to buy crude oil. And this is because crude oil is still mostly denominated in U.S. dollars worldwide, though it is shifting a bit to some other currencies. So this is what we saw happen in 2022 when we had very high oil prices. We did see a lot more U.S. Treasury selling, especially by countries without oil reserves. The second thing that higher oil prices can do is they can cause global investors to worry more about more inflation coming down the pike, just because crude oil is such is really the lifeblood of the global economy, manufacturing, transportation, trade, etc. And higher inflation expectations as a result of higher crude prices lead many investors to sell off their U.S. treasuries because they expect higher inflation, and so they won't be compensated as much at the current interest rates. They're demanding a higher interest rate. Higher inflation also makes the Fed more aggressive and makes it less safe to hold treasuries. So we have both groups selling U.S. treasuries, and this puts upward pressure on U.S. interest rates simply because when the price of treasuries goes down, interest rates on them go up, or the effective rate that you get when you're holding it. Now, higher interest rates hurt stock prices, they hurt real estate prices, especially housing, and they hurt lots of other things in the U.S., especially because the U.S. economy is so highly financialized, which is another way of saying there's a lot of debt in the U.S. economy because it's a developed economy. Lower stock and real estate prices lead to lower tax revenues, which then means that the U.S. government needs to issue even more debt to fund its operations and to make up the gap that's caused by spending exceeding tax revenues. U.S. government selling, or in other words, issuing more debt, especially when the Fed has stopped buying as they have now and they're doing quantitative tightening instead of quantitative easing, U.S. government selling of more debt leads to higher interest rates. And then this is really interesting. Higher interest rates have this knock-on effect for crude oil production simply because higher interest rates make it more difficult and expensive for U.S. shale oil producers, who have really been the largest global swing producer or marginal producer over the past decade, especially for U.S. oil production. Higher interest rates make it more difficult for these U.S. shale oil producers to borrow money for new oil projects. Fewer new U.S. oil projects means higher oil prices. Let the doom loop commence. So we have this doom loop between higher oil prices, higher interest rates, leading to more higher oil prices. If you're finding this video so helpful so far, I just ask you to hit that like and subscribe buttons to help support the channel. Now we add to this mix some dumb decisions made by American politicians. We have Biden pausing new oil and gas leases last year, and we had a court ruling that basically struck down a lower court's decision that had tried to stop the Biden administration from pausing the auction of new oil and gas drilling rights on federal lands. We also had the selling down of the oil reserves, the strategic petroleum reserves, which was basically oil in these caves, in these salt caves in the U.S. The administration drew down these oil reserves in conjunction with the midterm elections to try to keep gas prices lower. And I think this is an undisputed fact that's acknowledged by both parties. As a result, the SPR has reached levels that it hasn't seen since the mid-'80s. And this is a very dangerous thing because you want your country to have enough crude oil stockpiled. And it doesn't look like there's been any effort to restockpile oil after this drawdown. Now, Trump was definitely much more supportive of the oil industry, but not as supportive as you might think if you read this article from political. So I don't mean to completely rag on just one party. So how does this work? Putin or the Saudis, for example, cut oil production. Higher oil prices leads to higher U.S. interest rates, leads to lower stock and housing prices, leads to lower tax revenue, leads to more U.S. debt needing to be issued. And then what's worse about this is that all of this selling of treasuries, the issuance of more U.S. debt, especially when the Fed's not buying, leading to higher interest rates, this ultimately raises the cost of borrowing for the U.S. government, because when one treasury bond or bill matures, they pay it back by issuing another one. And as a result, we've been seeing, especially over the past 6 months, we've been seeing the debt load, the cost of servicing the debt for the U.S. government skyrocketing from very low rates to much, much higher rates as interest rates across the curve are pushed up. So then this leads to the question, maybe the Fed should just loosen monetary policy again, lower interest rates, and start up the money printers. That's a bit problematic as well, though I think that's ultimately what is going to happen probably this year. But the problem with this is this will also exacerbate commodity price inflation and CPI inflation. We saw what oil prices did when the Fed was really loose. So we're sort of damned if we do, damned if we don't. There's really no good solution now that the U.S. has let its debt levels get so high. The one solution that I can see is the Fed should just print money, go back to printing money, and buy as much Bitcoin as it can with that. But that, of course, is extremely unlikely to happen because the Fed would basically be signing its own death warrant in the process. If we take a look here at debt to GDP, we can see how high the debt to GDP levels are compared to where they were in the 70s and even the early 80s when Paul Volcker did his stuff and tightened rates. It's much more difficult when you get debt levels above 120% of GDP to really have any good choices. And at this point, the U.S. really only has bad choices apart from moving to a Bitcoin standard and buying Bitcoin. So what are some other possible policy solutions besides moving to Bitcoin? One of them, the really obvious one, is start granting new oil leases in the U.S. immediately. This doesn't have to be in Alaskan wildlife in very environmentally sensitive places, but there are lots of places where new oil leases can be turned on. Start building lots of new nuclear power plants in the U.S. This is an unfairly maligned industry. The amount of waste that it generates is very small. It can be stored in a very small area. I think all the nuclear waste that's been generated worldwide since the advent of nuclear power could fit in a football field. And there's just been a lot of bad press around nuclear power. But nuclear power has this advantage of being a very high return on investment and a high return on the energy invested that you get out of it. By contrast, solar and wind, you put a lot of energy into building the wind blades or building the solar panels, and it takes a lot longer to get as much energy out as you put in. Now, obviously, oil, I'm sort of conflating two things here, nuclear power and oil production. Oil is more important for transportation and nuclear is more important for power generation. But the general point I'm making here, especially with reference to Putin and China as well, is that energy independence in general is extremely important as a matter of national security. If we take a look at what China's doing, they have plans to build at least 150 new nuclear reactors in the next 15 years, more than the rest of the world has built in the past 35. Whatever you think of the CCP, and I think very poorly of them, but there are also some very smart people there, and I think they're making a good decision here, especially because China doesn't have a lot of natural resources in terms of crude oil, for example. So in the U.S., we need to move toward nuclear as quickly as we can. We need to stop virtue signaling about wind and solar, simply because these intermittent electricity sources, as I've talked about in other videos, they're a nightmare for the grid. Bitcoin miners can help a little bit to stabilize the grid. The other problem with these, of course, is that the lithium and cobalt mining and other metal mining involved is quite tough on the environment. If you take a look at what a lithium mine looks like, for example, it's not exactly pretty, and it's now coming out. People are finally realizing how these mines, how much child labor they use. And if you look into the eyes of a kid like this and realize he's working in a cobalt mine, you will be less sanguine about using solar and wind power. The thing is, Xi and Putin are both laughing at the U.S. for how good it is at shooting itself in the foot. The U.S. didn't used to be this way. There's actually a Chinese word for it, which is pretty funny. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's like baizuo. The literal translation of this is white left. And according to Wikipedia here, this refers to Western white liberal leftists. According to Chinese political scientist Zhang, the word baizuo refers to those who only care about topics such as immigration, minorities, LGBT rights and the environment, but lack a concept of real problems in the real world. And I'm not saying I'm against some of these white leftist issues necessarily, but this is when you're engaged in a global superpower competition, you have to decide on your priorities. Because if the U.S. were ever to get taken over by the CCP, for example, this would not be good for minorities. This would not be good for anyone. One thing I should say in conclusion of this video is please don't view this video as an apology for Trump or any version of the Republican Party. I would say that Republicans are literally the biggest losers in the world. I've already talked about what a loser Biden is in terms of his energy policy, but Republicans give them control of Congress and the White House, and they still can't figure out how to get anything significant done. We saw this under Bush the second, and we saw this under Trump. Both of them ran enormous budget deficits. They were not exactly the parties of small government. Trump promised to drain the swamp, but then proceeded to fill his cabinet with Goldman Sachs swamp creatures like Steve Mnuchin. Here's my shorthand for American politics. I can't remember where I heard this. It's definitely not original with me. Democrats are the party of the evil. Republicans are the party of the stupid. And I just want to make it very clear here that I refuse to align myself with either party. I'm not prejudiced. I hate both of them. Both parties are in bed with central bankers. And so I think the best personal decisions we can make, at least this is how I run my life: buy Bitcoin, get your friends and family to buy Bitcoin, help to educate people. Bitcoin fits in really well with the history of the U.S. and our political ideals, the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution, etc. I'd say there's nothing more American than Bitcoin, though of course Bitcoin is for the whole world. It's not just for America, it's for the whole world. It's for the left, it's for the right, it's for the center, it's for all tribes, it's for all races. But instead of worrying about party politics, buy Bitcoin, get your friends and family to buy Bitcoin, vote for Bitcoin-friendly politicians from any or either party, and make it very clear that you are a Bitcoin swing vote. Most of all, don't waste your precious time on Earth following two-party politics. It's very unlikely that there's a saying, don't put your faith in princes, somewhere from the Old Testament. And I think this is true. You're not going to fix the current problems by focusing on the left or focusing on the right. We need an orthogonal solution. And I think that orthogonal solution that we can all unite around, whether we're from the left or right, from our backgrounds, we can all unite around Bitcoin as this third party social movement that really tries to fix the world by fixing the money and focusing on creating the right incentives for politicians and for government structures and for public policy. Because if you don't have the right kind of money, you definitely politics and economics and culture seems to flow downstream from money, and this causes problems. That's why I'm quite focused on Bitcoin. But I hope you found this video helpful in terms of showing some of the relationships between global interest rates, and especially U.S. interest rates, and global energy production, and especially the power that Putin currently has as a very large swing producer of crude oil. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.